Hello and welcome to another episode of the Gritty Hour. I have my old cohort here, George Bauer from Las Vegas. How you doing, George?
I'm well, Tom, and you?
Good. When George heard that we were going to have a music-related podcast, he had to jump right in on it. You know, George with music. And the reason why he's in on it is because we have Dr. Jim Curtis here today, who's the author of a book called Decoding Dylan, Making Sense of the Songs That Changed Modern Culture. Welcome to the Gritty Hour, Doc.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So you were gracious enough to send me some essays, which music related, that sort of tied in American. It was mainly the essence was mainly American music,
yes.
and the continuum from. I think you started at Bing Crosby and worked your way up.
Yep.
Through Dylan and Springsteen and. So tell us a little bit about Decoding Dylan.
Like a lot of my books, a lot of my writing, I started with a sense of dissatisfaction. You probably know this, like 1,000 books that's been written on Dylan. Lots and lots of books have been written on Dylan. Mm-hmm. But as a lifelong Dylan fan, I kept reading these books and I kept thinking, but they're missing all these important points. It's very easy for Dylan fans to think about Dylan in purely biographical terms. They want to reduce all the songs to biography. They want to, in fact, a lot of Dylan fans tend to ignore the songs really and just think about Dylan's life and what he said at some time or other, what he did, who he recorded with, things like that. So I realized that I wanted to do something more than that. And that's why the word songs is in the subtitle of the book. I wanted the emphasis to be on the songs. How did Dylan come to write them? What do they mean? And how can we understand more generally, how can we understand Dylan not as an isolated genius, although I do believe he's a genius, he's not an isolated genius. We can understand him more richly, appreciate him in greater depth if we understand him by relating him to modern culture. And that's right. A lot of what I did in the book.
Right. Well, he was in his zone, if that's a term, I'd say from 62 right up through 72, maybe.
Easily.
Where he simply could do no wrong. Why do you think he's so, besides the obvious, why do you think he's so copied? There's so many artists that have done Dylan songs over the course of the years.
Well, what has happened roughly between, as you say, 62 and 72, is that Dylan ceased to be just a singer-songwriter. He became an institution. Now, as an institution, people want to tie into what he means for American culture. And that's why last figure I read was something like 600 different artists had recorded his songs. And I think that's what it is, that people want to know they're not just recording a great song, but they're tapping into something that really is an American institution. Dylan is so much beyond now any given individual or what any individual can do.
Mm-hmm. Even in the modern era, not too long ago, he wrote a song called "To Make You Feel My Love," which was done numerous times. The one that sticks out is Billy Joel did a version of that song. Mm-hmm. I think he had a moderate hit with it. Mm-hmm. So he continues to roll on.
He does.
Yes. George, you're a big Dylan fan. I was going to say Springsteen.
Yeah. Well, that too. Yeah, I've kind of found Dylan like through Springsteen and through you and the way we grew up and your older brothers and sisters and you know, just developed an appreciation for him and really love a lot of the stuff. I'm probably not as in depth as Jim here, but I certainly have pieces that I really, really like and really enjoy. Seen him a couple of times live, so yeah. It's a very, very tremendous performer. Changed music immeasurably.
Yeah, well,
and beyond that, I would say changed American culture.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can't disagree.
Well, I was going to say, like George, I sort of got into Dylan via Bruce Springsteen, and because you research an artist's influences, and it also got me into Hank Williams through
Really?
Springsteen. Yeah, well,
Oh.
Springsteen referenced the Hank Williams song in a song called "The River."
Right.
"Long Gone Lonesome Blues" is the name of the song. Hank Williams. It was thematic in the river. Anyway, but it also got me into and Van Morrison. It got me into both via Springsteen. So I was going to ask you, Doc. I know some of them, but what would you say was his biggest influences, Bob Dylan?
I want to answer that in two ways. I want to reference yet another song, and I want to go beyond the song to give you an answer that may be a little surprising. But let's take the song first. You may know a Dylan song called "Stuck in Mobile with the Memphis Blues Again."
Yes.
Okay? You realize, don't you, that's about Hank Williams and Elvis Presley.
Ah.
Where was Hank Williams born? Mobile. Where did Elvis live? Memphis. So what Dylan is doing there is working through what's been called the anxiety of influence. There's a theory that artists become their own man, so to speak. They're an independent artist by addressing the people who influence them. Influence is not just something that sits out there. It's something that you have to work with and assimilate to make yourself your own artist. And that's what I believe Dylan did. And that's why he is so anxious in Stuck in the Middle. Incidentally, Stuck in the Middle also references, would you believe, Shakespeare in the second chorus. Second verse, there's a reference to Shakespeare. So what Dylan does in his inimitable way is to take on these major figures in his life. Hank Williams, whom he says is the perfect songwriter. Elvis, who was the king of rock and roll. And I argue in the book, it's a little complicated and you have to listen to the song carefully. But I argue that some of the other things that Dylan did are also referencing Elvis in various ways. Now to answer your question, one of the things I talk about in the book that may be unexpected for some people is this: you can't understand Dylan in depth just as a singer-songwriter. You have to also take into consideration Dylan and the visual arts, as in when I paint my masterpiece. So what I argue in the book is this, that the most important figure in Dylan's life is somebody they never met. People know about their connection with Woody Guthrie because he actually went to see Woody Guthrie. But the interest in Woody Guthrie was passing on and lasted a couple of years. The real figure, the one who mattered and continues to matter today in Dylan's life, is Pablo Picasso.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a terrific book by Dylan's first girlfriend in Greenwich Village called Freewheeling Years in Greenwich Village. And what she says is that she read about Picasso and she was amazed by how similar they were. Let us agree that not all geniuses are friendly people. Dylan is a complicated man, to put it mildly, and is Picasso. They're both manipulative. They're both deeply secretive about their work, about what they do. And one of the keys to understanding Dylan is the tension between, on one hand, his charismatic persona as a performer. He's now given, thousands of concerts. But on the other hand, he's deeply, deeply personal and secretive. No one knows actually where he lives. He doesn't talk about where he lives. The classic example is that when his father died in 1965, he got a phone call from Hibbing saying his father died. He didn't even tell anybody that his own father had died.
Wow.
That's the extent to which Dylan is secretive about himself. So there's this very creative, I think it's a very creative tension between, on one hand, Dylan, the perfect persona, And on the other hand, Dylan, the intensely private person. He's an introvert. It's one of the strange things about being a performer. He's a very, very introverted performer. And that contradiction tells you a lot about him and helps you understand a lot about his career.
It's funny you say that, because that does come across when he is performing. He does seem almost reluctant to step up to the microphone.
Yeah.
And he doesn't talk in between songs. He just sings and plays.
Right.
Yeah.
And you guys have referenced Bruce Springsteen and Dylan. Notice the contrast in performing styles. How does Bruce come across on stage? He's lively. He talks to the band members. He jumps around. He gives these famous monologues, tells stories to the audience, brings the audience in. Dylan doesn't do any of that. He doesn't talk to his band members. He doesn't tell stories. He just comes up and sings his amazing songs.
Yeah. Even when he was with the band,
Even when he was with the band.
Yeah.
Guys that he knew and trusted.
The book deals with. I'm actually going to share the book's Amazon page while we're talking.
Okay.
But the book does deal with his effect on modern culture, and obviously the glaring example would be. Let me just get your page up. Hold it.
Okay.
The glaring example would be when he went electric, and the much to do about that. It was actually the band that was his band when he went from folk hero to electric guitar. And would that cause? Is there a nod to modern culture on that?
Well, I'd say it's a good deal more than a nod to modern culture. It is probably the most audacious single concert ever performed. There's a whole book about that one concert. The
Newport Jazz Festival, when he did the second set.
Well, it was folk music festival, really.
Right.
And the point is that these people were folk music fans. They expected Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger like songs. Dylan, being Dylan, wasn't going to give them that. He broke away, and my argument with the Dylan-Picasso connection is that Picasso gave them the audacity, and that's what it was, to break away. There's a segment of Picasso's life known as the Rose Period, in which he painted more or less representational paintings. But then with a painting called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which Susie Rotolo, his first girlfriend, showed him at the Museum of Modern Art, and argued that was a revelation for Dylan because it showed him he could break away from what he was doing and follow the imperatives of his own genius. That's what Picasso did. Everybody was shocked, including Picasso's friends who were painters, avant-garde painters. They were shocked when they first saw this thing. It wasn't even exhibited in the public until 1914. In the same way, Dylan followed the imperatives of his genius, and in doing so, shocked the audience. You probably know there's legends about this. You probably know that people booed him because they were folk music fans. They expected nice, easy to listen to acoustic music, and he wasn't going to give them that.
Right. Even in England at the Hammerstein, he was booed.
Exactly. Yes, he was. And people wanted their money back, and all kinds of agitation followed from this.
Right.
But that's the classic example of Dylan following the imperatives of his genius. And in a funny way, that's something that only an introvert would do. An introvert decides what he's going to do, and he goes and does it no matter what other people think.
Right.
And that's what Dylan did in that famous song.
So this change all of a sudden was not something to expand his career or expand his audience. This is just a guy that says, I'm sick of that, and I got to show them something else. What do you think his reasoning was for doing that at that time?
I think that geniuses like Dylan and like Picasso, I'm really serious, and it's a very important work. I've studied a lot of very gifted people. I think they feel some kind of inner drive, what I call it, the imperative of genius. It's something just has to come out of them, and they do it. and then do it regardless of the consequences. So not only was this not something that Dylan did to promote his concert, it was potentially career-killing concert. You know, before this, all these folk music fans adored Dylan. He wrote "Blowing in the Wind," after all. He performed with Pete Seeger, and they loved him. But he went out and did something that deeply alienated his audience. And only somebody who has an inner drive, who has to do what's coming out of the depths of his soul, is going to do that.
He did rather expand his audience, though, when he did, let's call it Go Electric.
Yes, but nobody thought so that night.
Right.
Nobody thought so right away.
Right.
Because, and then too, when Bringing It All Back Home came out, people didn't know what to make of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to talk just for a minute about that album and the meaning of that title. Dylan takes great care in giving his albums particular meaning. So let's think for a moment about that album title, Bringing It All Back Home. What is the it all? And my answer is it's European art. It's Picasso, and it's also the poetry of French symbolism, which we know he had been reading in Greenwich Village, like everybody else in Greenwich Village, 63, 64, building up to Like a Rolling Stone. The break comes with a song called The Chimes of Freedom. You guys remember that song?
Yes.
And what do Chimes of Freedom do? Chimes of Freedom flash. In folk music, to which the song's related, chimes ring out. They ring out freedom, they ring out this and that, but not in Dylan. They flash. That's what's called the use of one sense in terms of another sense. And he had found the reference for this, the freedom to do it, in the poetry of the French symbolists. So what he was doing was bringing it all, Picasso and French symbolism, back home, assimilating it into an American idiom. When he did that, we can think, gee, isn't that something? And we can also ask ourselves, has anybody else ever done that? And my answer is yes, that is what in the 20th century great artists have done. Many of them have gone to Europe, they've studied in Europe, but they realize that European art doesn't quite fit an American audience or American viewers. So they come back home, and what do? They bring it all back home. They assimilate it in various ways and use what they've learned in Paris to make it make sense to American audiences. That's what Dylan was doing in bringing it all back home.
Just expand on that, because as I recall, there's a spot in the song where he says the chimes of freedom crashing, and then there's a later spot where he says the chimes of freedom flashing, as you just mentioned.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just expound on why do you think he used both terms in that song?
Well, crashing is very close to being sound, right?
Mm-hmm.
We say the sounds crash. So that's a reference to the way it would have been. After all, he was still very much connected to Joan Baez and the folk movement at this time.
Right.
So then he's breaking away from it. It means a lot to him, but he can't stay there. This is exactly the turning point. Chimes of Freedom is the song that builds up to and prepares us for Like a Rolling Stone, because he breaks away from the old traditional folk song idiom in which chimes make sounds. Chimes don't make sounds in the new Dylan. There's also various references to the nonviolent peace movement, songs, Soldiers on the Road, whose strength is not to fight. It's breaking away. And then we have, in this very rapid change, 64, 65, 66, moving into the great albums, culminating in Blonde on Blonde, we have Dylan definitively breaking away from folk music and everything that folk music stands for. My favorite example of Dylan's maturity is Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues, which has one of the greatest first lines of all American songs. Here's the first line of that song, if you don't remember it. When you're lost in the rain in Juarez and it's Easter time too. That's the beginning of a song.
Mm.
But none of the stanzas, the 4 stanza song, none of the stanzas are related to any of the others. They don't tell a story. They don't create a situation. What they do is create evocative images. And
Right.
it's completely broken away from storytelling, broken away from images that make sense in obvious sensory terms.
Yeah, well, it's just sticking with Chimes of Freedom for a second. It did reflect the current times because there's an anti-war message in that song. There's a civil rights message in that song.
Are you sure?
Well, just with that's when the Vietnam War was kicking into high gear,
Yes,
and
it is.
the Vietnam War protests were kicking into high gear concurrently. And there is a line, you just mentioned it, the whose strength is not to fight.
The warriors whose strength is not to fight. Exactly.
Is
That's
it?
homage to the to Joan Baez
Mm-hmm.
and to nonviolent peace movement.
Yeah.
But that's just the one line. The situation in Chimes of Freedom, as you may recall, is that she and I, some unnamed person, excuse me, is taking refuge from the storm. And the storm imagery will occur again and again and again. That's why the Chimes of Freedom is such a seminal song in Dylan's career.
Yeah. Well, obviously, he was a very prolific songwriter in that time. He was hitting his muse, but even after he went electric, as I use that term, Joan Baez still continued to cover a lot of his songs.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. As great songwriter would. Incidentally, speaking of Dylan and Joan Baez, I have to mention her most moving song. Do you know her song Diamonds and Rust?
Yes.
That, of course, is about Dylan.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most wonderful, moving songs she ever wrote. It may be the most important song ever written that references Dylan.
Yeah. It does allude to his introvertness because she does mention that, it was hard to get anything out of him emotionally or any other kind of way back when they were hanging out together.
Yep.
So, and I think they were dating at the time, or at least in a relationship.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. They were. It was probably the most important relationship of her life before she married David Harris.
And she did give him more. Yeah.
Dylan, being Dylan, moved on from her without really telling her, and that's when he married Sarah.
Yeah. Well, she did make a career. I'd say it's an argument could be made. She made a career out of doing his music.
Well, among many other things, yes.
Yeah. She did put a more palpable voice to his songs.
She's obviously she's a better singer than he is. Right?
Yeah, well, that's what I was trying not to be crass, but yeah.
Making the notes.
But I did allude to this in the beginning of the podcast. I think that's another reason why he's so covered. He's a prolific songwriter that wrote phenomenal songs that were ahead of their time. But I can see artists saying, I could do this better than him. I could do a version better than him, and that's why, Yeah,
you can argue that a number of the covers of Dylan songs are really better than his versions.
Yeah.
I don't have any problem with anybody saying that.
Yeah. What's the name of that band? Oh, the Byrds. The Byrds did a lot of Dylan songs.
Sure.
Yeah. So, Georgie, you're a big Byrds fan. McGuinn, Clark, and Hillman.
Not that big a Burns fan, but
No.
I'm definitely familiar with some of their versions of Dylan songs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Incidentally, I had the honor of meeting Roger McGuinn in 2019. As you may know, there is now a Bob Dylan Institute in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they hosted the first International Bob Dylan Symposium. And Roger came and gave a concert, talked about his relationship with Dylan and so forth. I love when you are at that level, you can say things like this. Roger was in the middle of his concert, was talking about Dylan, his relationship with him, and he said, Dylan and I were playing basketball one afternoon. It's hard to imagine Dylan and Roger McGuinn playing basketball, but apparently they were, and that's how they planned the Rolling Thunder concert tour.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were
Interesting.
playing basketball.
Hmm. Well, he mentions him in one of his songs. What's that? Um, we gonna fly. Tonight's gonna my bride's gonna come. Do you know
Mhm.
that song? I don't want to sing
Um,
because it'll ruin the whole podcast. But
it'll come to me at 2:30 this morning.
I know, and I can't think of the title. But he does mention Roger McGuinn in the song.
Mhm.
Yeah, you ain't going nowhere, I think is the name of the song.
Mhm.
Yeah. So interesting. So you do take a cerebral approach to this, and you do an analysis essentially on his lyrics and
Mhm.
his lyrics effect on culture.
Mhm.
So give us a couple of examples if you don't mind.
Well, what you could say is that Dylan broke open the Great American Songbook. He has great respect, not just for Hank Williams, but for Harold Orland, the other songwriters of the Great American Songbook. But he knew at some sort of conscious level that he had to go beyond them and do things that they couldn't do or wouldn't do or didn't want to do. So he had an effect that was comparable to what happened when, for example, Vasily Kandinsky started painting abstract paintings, breaking away completely from anything that was representational. The word I would use that sums up the effects of Dylan's songs is not so much influence, because that's overused and people talk about it in a simplistic way. What I'd say is that Dylan's songs gave people an awareness of possibilities. They knew what they could do, what was possible to do that nobody had ever done before. And in a funny way, that has produced a lot of very bad songs.
Hmm.
If you really care about Dylan and Dylan's work as I do, then you have to admit that a lot of Dylan imitators wrote pretty bad songs.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's easy to do that once you break away from storytelling. Once you break away from the idea that the images have to hold together in some consistent way, then you can be self-indulgent. And a lot of people who are self-indulgent are not as great a songwriters as Dylan is. So they produce a lot of not very good songs. In the same way, to continue that, I would say that there's a lot of abstract painting that's not very good either. Because once you break away from the idea that a painting has to look like something in the real world, then you can do a lot of things. You can be self-indulgent, and very few artists are incapable of the self-discipline that it takes to paint abstract paintings and not just splash paint on canvas. In general, I would say that's one of the things I hope people will take away from this podcast and from my book, which is that understanding Dylan just as a singer-songwriter is inadequate. To respect the depth of his genius, you have to go beyond songs and think about the visual art, especially 20th century painting.
Well, based on what you just said, it brings to mind someone who was unfortunately compared to Dylan when Dylan was in his most prolific time was Donovan.
Mm-hmm.
Was he from? He was Welsh, I think, or
Yes. Mm-hmm.
yeah. And would you throw him in that category of someone who's just writing like Dylan but not quite as good?
I would, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Dylan, by all accounts, Donovan was a very pleasant guy, but he didn't have whatever it is that it takes to create lasting songs. I remember the title of his album, one of the classic 60s album titles. Donovan put out an album called A Gift from a Flower to a Garden.
Mm.
And that so sums up the 60s.
Right.
But it sums it up in a way that's immediately easy to grasp. Dylan's song titles and album titles are not easy to grasp.
Right.
That I think is a measure of the difference between Donovan, who once again, by all accounts, is a very nice guy and moderately talented guy, good-looking guy, but didn't have the force, the drive, the genius that Dylan has.
Right. He had a lot of good songs. That's just, it always seemed to me like The Wind. I listened to The Wind. What's the name of that song? I might as well try and catch the wind. And
Might as well try and
Atlantis,
test.
it seemed like he was struggling to fill that. I'm the English version of Dylan
Yeah, I think
persona.
that obviously derives from Blowing in the Wind, right?
Yeah, it was obviously a struggle for him to live up to that.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
when you can make such an obvious connection, it's a sign that the second song is as good as the first song.
Yeah, it's in that sense, it was easier for Joan Baez because she's doing Dylan songs. She's not
Yeah.
she's not trying to recreate Dylan in a different way, which I think Donovan tried to do.
Yeah, I think that's a point well taken.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. By the way, since George has mentioned Bruce Springsteen, I would like to talk a little bit about Bruce Springsteen.
Well, this is why George wanted to be on this podcast.
Okay, so George, here we go.
Okay.
What I really care about is not just individual performers, but the history of American popular music. I have such love for it that I want to show my respect, and the way I do, my way of showing respect is to understand the performers in depth and their interrelationships. So here's what I begin with. If you love rock and roll, then you want to understand that what I call the spine of American rock and roll is three performers: Elvis Presley, Bob Dylan, and Bruce Springsteen. Everybody else can be related to these three giants in one way or another, and all three of these giants are, of course, related to one another. Elvis was the beginning. And then, did you guys know, I think I referenced this in the book or in one of my articles on Dylan, Douglas Brinkley, I think it was, in an interview with Dylan, commented that Dylan once went to Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis's hometown and my hometown, so he could soak up the essence of Elvis. Moreover, speaking of anxiety about heroes as we were, Dylan, obviously, being Dylan, could have met Elvis if he wanted to, but he chose not to meet him. I think he would have felt overpowered. He anticipated he would have felt overpowered and would have lost some of his own force and drive and belief in himself if he had literally been in the same room with Elvis. But that really wasn't an option for Bruce. Do you guys know the story of when Bruce heard Hound Dog for the first time?
I don't know if I know that. Now, I've heard the story when he tried to climb over the mountain at Graceland, over the wall at Graceland.
Graceland.
Yeah, but I don't know. Maybe George knows.
No, I don't know. I don't know that story.
Before that, he was 8 years old, Bruce was. And he heard Hound Dog on the car radio in his mom's car. And being Bruce, he was simply overwhelmed by it. And I love later talking about it. This is what it said, and I love this because it so sums up Bruce. He said, not only did I want to be Elvis, I couldn't understand why everybody didn't want to be Elvis.
Right. Going back real quick to your story about Dylan visiting Mississippi.
Yeah.
About 10 years ago, there was a news article where the police were called out to not Freehold, but more where Bruce grew up, for like a male loitering in the neighborhood. It turned out to be Dylan. And he tried to identify himself, and they didn't believe who he was. So they had to bring him back to the police station. But in comparison to his, I don't want to say obsession, but his interest in Elvis going to Mississippi, he seemed to visit other places where he was trying to get a feel, as you indicated, of the artist and where they grew up and maybe what made them tick a little bit and stuff like that.
Yep.
Also, the other point is on Dylan wrote on the first Traveling Wilburys album. He wrote
Tweeter and the Monkey Man.
And that is believed to be
a nod.
A nod to Bruce. There's like 7 or 8 different references to Springsteen songs in that particular song. So and so he does a lot of that. They're all it's almost like a game going back and forth, and obviously Bruce did a lot of covers of Dylan. I mean,
Sure.
he did live
Dylan.
Chimes of Freedom one that was released that was, I think, is tremendous. But yeah, it's just how the psychology of these guys and these artists work, and it's very very interesting.
Since I'm convinced that American popular music in all its forms and genres matters so much, I want to give you another analogy.
Mhm.
I want to begin way back where my first book on rock and roll, Rock Eras, began with Bing Crosby, who's the first great megastar of American popular music. And so we have the connection from Bing Crosby to Frank Sinatra. Bing Crosby was Sinatra's idol when he was growing up. And he idolized him. He even started smoking a pipe like Bing Crosby. Frank Sinatra looks very strange smoking a pipe, I have to tell you. And then Frank Sinatra became Frank Sinatra. He has a series of great concerts that he gave at the Paramount Theater in 1943, became his own man, and ultimately starred in a movie with Sinatra called High Society. One of the great scenes from that is a star turn that Frank and Bing have together. So you take that. That was an acknowledgement on Bing Crosby's part of Sinatra's stardom and acceptance of him as an equal. So you start with that. And then you go to Bob and Bruce. Well, I found a concert on YouTube several years ago. I don't think it's there anymore. But it's the first concert in which Bob and Bruce appeared together. Have you ever seen any of those concerts in which they're together? Sometimes there's a stage full of performers and Bruce and Bob are together there. But this is a Dylan concert. Dylan turns to the wings and he says, and it is very important, you can't tell me he didn't mean this seriously. He says, now I want to bring out Mr. Bruce Springsteen. When Bob Dylan calls you Mr., you have arrived. You are an equal. You are there. It's like being inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Interesting.
That was one of the most crucial moments that I've ever seen in a concert, because it was like music history coming together before your eyes.
Right.
Well, Dr. Curtis was generous enough in preparation for this podcast to send George and I two essays that he had written, one called Catching Geniuses at Work, and one called Rock Eras. And the one that I want to mention is Rock Eras, because you do mention Bing Crosby. You try and tie together a continuum of American music.
That's really important to me. Yes.
Yeah. And did I scoop you, by the way? I had mentioned, George, to Dr. Curtis that I had learned that Jim Morrison of The Doors had emulated his vocal style
Dean Martin. You mentioned
of Dean Martin. I got to know if I scooped you on that or not, Doc.
Yes, you did. Absolutely. I had not heard that. That was revelation. But as you might imagine, I love that because it's exactly this connection.
Yeah.
That I'm so interested in.
And if you hear the Doors with that in mind, you can actually see it. I could, like People Are Strange, the song People Are Strange, you could see Dean Martin singing that. Yeah.
Because it's strange knowing what we know about Jim Morrison.
Right.
It's strange to think of it, but he was a crooner.
Yes.
He had a lovely, smooth baritone voice.
Yes. Riders on the Storm. You can hear Dean Martin singing that too.
You can. Absolutely, you can. Yeah.
So what brought it up was that great essay you wrote called Rock Eras, and you do cover the continuum through the ages, so to speak, from Bing, right?
I was pretty proud of this. My first chapter is called Bing, the Chairman and the King.
Right. Yeah.
Which shows the continuity from Bing Crosby to Frank Sinatra to Elvis Presley.
Right.
And I have written a play about this, which may or may not eventually go on the stage somewhere. It's called When Frank Met Elvis. The first time Elvis appeared in public after he got out of the Army in 1960 was where else? On the Frank Sinatra show.
Right. I've seen that video. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a fascinating video because that too shows the dynamism between these two enormous egos. And
Yeah.
seeing Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley perform together is just amazing.
Well, they had one song encapsulating. I think Sinatra was singing an Elvis part of it,
Mhm.
and Elvis was singing Sinatra's part of it. I can't remember.
Yeah,
I think it was Witchcraft.
Witchcraft, yes.
I don't know if Nelson Riddle arranged it or not, but it was well crafted. That's for sure.
It was. Sure.
Yeah. But you ever see that one, Georgie?
I have not. I have not. I have to look at
You could probably find it on
it's
YouTube.
Yeah, it's absolutely on YouTube. Mhm.
Yeah.
Because I think if you just Google Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, it'll bring it up.
It'll probably be the first thing that comes
You
up,
know,
actually.
it's a black and white kinescope, which is what it would have been in 1960, but it's absolutely terrific.
Yeah. And there is you could probably also find this on, they did a tribute to Frank Sinatra, gotta say in the late 80s, if I'm not mistaken, where Springsteen sings Give My Love to Rose, which is a Frank Sinatra song. Great version of it.
Mhm.
I'm sure you've seen that one, George.
I have.
Yeah. So that's why that essay you wrote, Rock Eras, resonated so well to me, because it clarified, and you do take a cerebral approach to it, which is refreshing to me,
Good.
of the continuity of American pop music as it goes down through the ages. I'm not sure there's anything in the present day that you could tie into the back. I know George mentioned the Traveling Wilburys before,
Mhm.
which is sort of kind of recent in our scope of things, but
Well, let me mention my current favorite performer, Lady Gaga. Did you guys see the special that she did with Tony Bennett?
I've seen snippets of it. Yes.
It was wonderful.
Yeah, she's very
Really.
talented. Yeah.
She is
Yeah,
talented.
I mean, not only is she talented, her version, my wife and I joke about this, her version of the Star Spangled Banner is never going to be surpassed. And every time we watch a football game and we see some second or third rate singer come out and sing the Star Spangled Banner, we look at each other and say, she's not Lady Gaga, is she?
Well, my favorite version is always going to be Whitney Houston's.
She had the range, absolutely. She had the range to sing it. But my larger point about this concert is that it is obvious that Lady Gaga adores Tony Bennett and everything that he stands for.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, once again, my favorite interest, namely the connections between performers who might not seem to be connected otherwise. That's why I loved your connection between Jim Morrison and Dean Martin.
Right.
So Lady Gaga and Tony Bennett look about as different as two performers might. Their songs, their interests, and so forth are quite different. But there's this recognition, I think, that occurs between really talented people, in which really talented people recognize the other person's abilities.
Right.
It's a wonderful thing to see. So
Right.
really, if you guys have not seen that whole concert, I'd urge you to say it's probably on YouTube like everything else.
Right.
Lady Gaga and Tony Bennett.
But if I could tie is Rock Eras, the essay, available publicly?
Yes, it is. I believe it's on YouTube. It's on Amazon. Mhm.
Oh, it's also on Amazon. Okay, good,
believe it
because
is,
I
yes.
think people need to read that. It's
I think so too.
well crafted. It certainly is. But tying back to this book, Decoding Dylan, it's selling a lot. It sells very well. I see a lot of great reviews on it. But he does seem to be the personification of that Rock Era's continuity that you're discussing in the Rock Era's essay.
Yes,
He
think
does
so.
sort of personify that.
Yeah, there's a
On the
long
other-
essay in Rock Eras on
Yeah.
Dylan, and that essay was the origin of the book Decoding Dylan.
Understood.
Because I realized that I had more to say about
Makes-
Dylan. I
Makes
wanted to
perfect sense. Yeah.
do that. And
Could you talk
speaking
a-
of continuity, my last chapter in Decoding Dylan is another one of the connections that I like to make, because once you start making connections, you think, well, all these great performers are singers and they're connected. Well, why limit ourselves just to music? So one of the things I do in the Dylan book, as you know, is to talk about the relevance of Dylan's Jewish heritage. Not that he's religious, but the ethnic importance is very great because there have been so many Jewish performers. The great songwriters of the Tin Pan Alley era were mostly Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So at the end, my last chapter is one that brings together a number of things that are implicit in the book throughout. So I talk about three performers, three Jewish geniuses, as I call them. They all started in Greenwich Village in the early to mid 60s, and then they went on to have amazing careers lasting for decades and decades and decades. And they are Bob Dylan, Barbra Streisand, and Woody Allen.
I was expecting you to say Neil Diamond.
Oh no,
Yeah.
Neil Diamond is like he's an American Donovan, I think. Nice guy. He's written some pleasant songs, but he's no Dylan.
Yeah,
Never will
yeah.
be. But you take these three performers, and you think, have they not had careers that have lasted decade after decade after decade? Do they not have the ticket sales to prove they're enormously popular? They've sustained that popularity over a long time. And that's when the performers become part of the culture. My argument is you simply cannot understand American popular culture after about 1970 without regard to Bob Dylan, Barbra Streisand, and Woody Allen. Three Jewish geniuses. They started the same place, the same time, literally within a few blocks of each other at Gertie's Folk City and places like that. And then went on in various ways to revolutionize what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
My argument about Barbra Streisand is that basically she destroyed Broadway as a star-making machine. Before Barbra Streisand, there were various people who became stars on Broadway and then went on to have great careers in Hollywood, like Mary Martin. Nobody ever did that after Barbra Streisand because she broke that model. Nobody was ever great enough to stand up to her.
Well,
So
she sort of went in reverse, right?
Yeah. So after Barbra Streisand, Broadway became songwriters' place. So you have obviously Stephen Sondheim, right? But there's not a single important star who ever became a star on Broadway after Barbra Streisand.
Interesting analogy, yeah.
And then we get to Woody Allen, because what is the great line from Fiddler on the Roof? From the song there, the first song that Tibby sings, tradition, tradition. And what is Woody Allen all about? About dealing with tradition in one way or another. Virtually all of his movies have some reference to tradition. The classic example, obviously, is Play It Again, Sam. You guys remember the opening of Play It Again, Sam?
I've seen the movie, but I don't remember the opening.
The opening, the very first thing that you see in Play It Again, Sam, is Woody Allen sitting in a movie theater. And what is Woody Allen watching? He's watching Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca.
Yes, that's
right. So you see in the first shot, you see Woody, and then on the screen is Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca.
Mm-hmm.
And then the point of that movie is that there's a Bogart impersonator who comes on as the ghost of Bogey and urges Woody to become his own man. It's that thing I was talking about with Dylan and Hank Williams and with Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan. And now we have also Woody Allen and Humphrey Bogart, in which you have this tremendously gifted performer who is gifted enough to understand the geniuses that have come before him. But he feels intimidated by them. My God, who wouldn't feel intimidated by Humphrey Bogart, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or Elvis Presley. So what you have to do if you're going to have a career is to overcome that, to come to terms with the person who has influenced you, but prove that you're your own man or your own woman, in the case of Barbra Streisand. And the same thing also applies for Barbra Streisand, because Yentl, take Barbra Streisand's famous movie, Yentl. Yentl is what about? What is the theme of Yentl? Breaking tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Because the point is that she plays a girl disguising herself as a boy because a girl couldn't get an education. in the shtetls of Eastern Europe at the time. So what does she do? She acknowledges tradition and she also breaks it. It's a theme that you find over and over again in the careers of these three great performers, and they have defined, I'm telling you, American popular culture in our time.
That's an interesting analogy. What do you think, George?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I was going to bring it all back home here.
Yeah.
No pun intended. By saying, when Dylan was in his prime, most prolific time, let's put it that way. Tin Pan Alley, which you did mention, was the predominant producer of music culture at the time, early 60s,
Sure.
up until the early 60s. So even before he went electric, he did break away from that. The hits come from Tin Pan Alley theme,
Right.
He sort of took the Weavers and Pete Seeger and brought it to a newer, younger audience. He was at the right place at the right time too, and that had a lot to do.
Always are.
Yeah, you didn't do any analysis. You mentioned about the Jewish culture. You didn't do any on Dylan. You didn't do any analysis on Minnesota.
Well, in the book, I talk a little bit about Minnesota. There's yet another pattern. What I want to do over and over again with Dylan and all the people I study is to relate them to something larger, not take them as isolated individuals.
Right.
And it's a very curious thing. There's now a substantial literature just on the subject of creativity. A lot of very smart psychologists have written about creativity, and they've studied the patterns in the lives of creative people. And you know what one of the most interesting and important patterns is in the lives of creative people? They have problems with their fathers.
Yeah.
Over and over. It's really remarkable. I'm writing a book on drama right now, and name me a major playwright. Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, whoever you want. Fellows who wrote Downton Abbey, the greatest living playwright is probably Tom Stoppard. All of these guys had serious problems with their fathers in one way or another. Sometimes it's not even fathers. Sometimes the father just dies.
When they were young, yeah.
Yeah, you may know that Mel Brooks, for example, had that in his life. His father died of a heart attack when he was 2 years old. Wasn't anybody's fault. His father wasn't abusive, but he did grow up without a father. Over and over again, you find the lives of creative people have this. Well, Dylan's father wasn't abusive the way the father of, say, Michael Jackson was, or of the Beach Boys. But he was distant. He was just content to be a businessman. And in Chronicles, Dylan's autobiography, has this wonderful line. He says, "My father and I didn't live in the same town." He was just different. There was just no connection. And it's this lack of connection, I think, that really drove him out of Hibbing. That was the initial impetus, I think, that drove him out of Hibbing first to University of Minnesota, and then ultimately to
Greenwich Village.
To Greenwich Village, sure.
Yeah.
Now, Dylan has made one connection to Minnesota that is completely off the wall. Only it's the kind of thing only Dylan would say. Do you guys know what Dylan is doing right now? He's not writing many songs. You know what he's doing?
Not really, no.
I think
He's making
touring.
welded iron sculpture.
Oh.
Really?
Yeah.
He's received major commissions for welded iron sculptures in public places.
Wow. So he's found a new muse.
Yeah. He writes songs, he paints, he welds sculptures.
And he's also touring, Georgie?
He's got this never-ending tour, I think they call it.
Never-ending tour.
Yeah, I don't know.
So,
I don't know any recent dates, but
as you might imagine, people wondering, what in the world are you doing making iron sculptures? And what Dylan said was, I grew up in the iron ore country of northern Minnesota. A connection to iron. That's what he said.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah.
I know Dylan really well, and I would never have thought of that one.
Yeah. Well, George and I's one of our favorite movies. George and I grew up together. was
Yeah.
The Last Waltz, and I wanted to touch
Uh-huh.
on that because
Mhm.
not only is Dylan prominent in the movie, obviously,
Yeah.
as the proponent of the band to begin with,
Right. Uh-huh.
but it does have the continuum that
Mhm.
almost like a concert describing your essays.
Yeah.
You know, you have Muddy Waters, you have Eric Clapton, you have a
John,
whole who
Dr.
These
John.
people.
Dr. John, yeah,
Mhm.
Van Morrison. So
Right. And
yeah,
why is it called the last waltz? The last waltz is something that's inimical to rock and roll in various ways.
yeah,
And it's just an acknowledgement of music that most people grew up with and are surrounded by.
yeah. So that's a visual incompensation, but
Mhm.
I think anybody who loves Dylan should get your book, Decoding
Oh,
Dylan.
terrific. I love you for
Yeah.
saying that. Thank you. As
Making
you imagine, I
sense.
think that too, but I
Yeah,
didn't
well,
know, so I would say it.
Decoding Dylan, making sense of the songs that changed modern culture. It
Mhm.
it does have illustrations in it, as it says on the page here, and you can
Mhm.
get it from Amazon.
You can.
Paperback version, some
Mhm.
used. You can get it from Amazon. Is that the only place you get it? Do you have a
I
site for it,
believe
or
I believe so. Yes.
okay?
Mhm.
And it's been well received, and anybody who loves music, not just American music, but anybody who loves music, would certainly appreciate this book. And I highly recommend all our listeners and viewers go out and purchase this.
Thank you
And
so much. I appreciate the plug.
in the show notes for this podcast, I do want to. I'll find the link to the Rock Eras essay because I think people
Would
should
enjoy
pick
that.
that
Yeah.
up as well.
Mhm.
And I certainly appreciate your time tonight, Doc. It was very nice having you on.
It's been a great pleasure. I rarely have a chance to talk to people who know and love the same things I know and love.
Well, it's called the Goody Hour, but George and I could talk about music till 3 o'clock in the morning. So, yeah. So if I don't cut it off now, we'll be here till the wee hours. But
Yeah, there you go.
I'd love to have you back when you're ready for your next book, the one you're
Okay,
exploring now.
I'll take you up on that. I would
Okay.
love to do that.
All right.
Thanks
Well,
so much.
thanks again, sir, for coming by. And George, thanks for co-hosting. I appreciate
Anytime,
that.
Tom. Take care,
And,
Jim. Pleasure.
What a great pleasure this has been. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, guys.